The Interstellar Institute of Applied Sciences had processed 1,847 students through its gates in its 60-year history. It had received the children of 11 recognized galactic civilizations. It had welcomed hive fragment scholars and energy state, beings and creatures so large that special corridors had been constructed purely for their comfort. It had, by the careful count of Senior Registrar Oven, never once been surprised by an arrival. Until the morning the second human walked through. Gate 7. Oven was Silvathi. He had 4 arms, a face built for patience, and a mind that cataloged information the way other species breathed, automatically, constantly, without effort. He had read the file on Mara Voss 3 times before her scheduled arrival. Female. 27 years by Earth reckoning, graduate-level specialization in emergency systems engineering. The notes from the Earth Liaison Office described her as highly qualified, adaptable, and strongly recommended. What the file had not prepared him for was how completely ordinary she looked. She came through Gate 7 with a single travel case on wheels, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the station floor. She wore plain dark clothing. Her hair was pulled back from her face in a practical, undecorated way. She was not large. She was not luminous. She carried no visible weapons, which Oven knew meant nothing with humans, but still, the Keth students always at least looked dangerous. The Lumini students shimmered. The Veth arrived in coordinated clusters that moved like one breathing organism. Mara Voss arrived looking like someone who had a list and intended to get through it. She stopped at his desk. She looked up at him. He was considerably taller than her, and she said, "Hi, Mara Voss, Earth. I think I'm registered?" In a tone that implied she was reasonably confident about this but would not be devastated to discover otherwise. Oven processed her registration. He issued her credentials, her room assignment, her cohort placement. He explained the atmosphere regulation in her quarters, the food dispensary locations, the emergency protocols. She listened. She did not take notes, but her eyes had a focused quality that suggested the information was going somewhere specific inside her. When he finished, she thanked him, asked one clarifying question about the food dispensary hours that was. He had to admit the correct clarifying question to ask, and then she walked away with her clicking case toward the residential wing. Oven watched her go. He filed a brief note in her record. Arrival unremarkable. Student appears oriented. No accommodation issues identified. He almost left it there. He added one more line after a pause. Something I cannot currently name. The cohort met in Study Room 7 on the first afternoon. Study Room 7 was designed for mixed species use. The table at its center could raise or lower on any of its 6 sections independently. The lighting shifted across a range wide enough to accommodate visual systems from infrared to high ultraviolet. The chairs were modular, reconfiguring to suit any body type that sat in them. The room was, in all the ways the Institute could manage, neutral ground. Xylan arrived first. Xylan was a Veth. Specifically, Xylan was a fragment, a portion of consciousness that the Veth hive mind occasionally detached for the purpose of external education, sending it out like a probe to gather information that the whole could absorb upon the fragment's return. The fragment body was the approximate size of a large earth dog, insectoid in structure, with compound eyes that caught the light in faceted angles. Xylan moved with the particular stillness of a being that had no self-consciousness, no performance. The hive did not watch. The fragment simply was. Xylan sat in the center of the table and waited. Kelrus came next. Kelrus was Lumini. The Lumini were, in the simplest possible terms, beings of coherent electromagnetic energy that had long ago developed the technology to maintain physical forms when interaction with the material world required it. The form, Kelrus maintained, was tall, vaguely bilateral, and emitted a faint, steady glow in the blue-white range. She moved without sound. She sat without weight. She regarded Xylan with the pleasant neutrality of someone with whom she had shared an institution for 2 semesters. Drogan entered third, and the room noticed. The Keth were an old species, old in the way that carries geological weight. They had been part of the galactic community for 400 years, long enough that other civilizations had stopped flinching at their size and had started flinching at their intelligence instead, which they found considerably more unsettling. Drogon stood 7.5 feet and was proportioned in a way that suggested his homeworld's gravity had been making extremely serious points for a very long time. He was scaled, dark gray, with eyes that processed light in 4 wavelengths, simultaneously. He sat in the section of table that had already raised itself in anticipation of him. He placed both hands flat on the surface and regarded the room with the expression of someone conserving energy for things that deserved it. Mara came last. She came in pulling her travel case, which she parked against the wall. She looked at Xylan. She looked at Kael'rus. She looked at Drogon. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Mara, she said, pointing at herself. Human, Earth, Emergency Systems Engineering. She looked at each of them in turn as she said it, making eye contact with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that eye contact meant I see you and I am not a threat, and applied it universally regardless of species. The 3 of them introduced themselves in return, in varying degrees of formality. Drogon gave his full clan name, his homeworld region, his weight class, and his gravity index, all in the clipped, efficient cadence of a species that considered unnecessary words a form of disrespect. Xylan communicated in the translated approximation. The Institute's systems provided, describing itself as a temporary external process of the Veth whole, designated study fragment Xylan for the duration of this academic cycle. Kael'rus stated her name, her field, and her home system in a voice that had a faint harmonic undertone to it, like a chord with an extra note you felt rather than heard. Mara listened to all 3 of them with her full attention. She did not appear overwhelmed. She did not appear to be performing calm. She simply sat in her chair with her forearms on the table and listened in the way that certain creatures listen, with the whole of themselves pointed at the sound. When they finished, she said, Great. I want to make sure I get your names. All right. Can you say them again slowly? Drogon blinked his outer eyelids, which among the Keth was an involuntary response to surprise. He said his name again, slowly. Mara repeated it back. She got the tonal shift in the second syllable slightly wrong. She asked if she had it right. He told her she had it approximately correct and that the precise inflection required a palatal structure she likely did not possess. She said, Fair enough, and repeated the closest approximation again until he confirmed it was acceptable. She did this with all 3 of them. Xylan observed this process and transmitted a brief data packet toward its connection with the whole, which the whole received and noted with the particular interest it reserved for genuinely new information. The first 3 weeks proceeded according to schedule. The cohort's coursework was intensive. Professor Halveth, a Selvathi of the older generation, long-armed, precise, with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from having explained complex things to complicated beings for several decades, led them through the first module on cross-species systems theory. The work was real work, the kind that required attention not just to the material but to how different minds processed the material, which was, as Halveth made clear on the first day, rather the entire point. Mara worked hard. This was the first thing the others noticed, and it was unremarkable because they all worked hard. The notable thing was not the effort, but the shape of it. She made mistakes with a specific quality. She would produce an analysis that was wrong, read the correction, pause, not a pause of distress, but a pause of genuine reorientation, and then produce a second analysis that had integrated the correction so completely that it did not feel like correction but like excavation, like she had simply found the right answer that had been there underneath. Xylan found this interesting. The hive mind learned through the accumulation of experience across thousands of simultaneous processes. It was a distributed system. Individual error was nearly impossible because individual thought was nearly impossible. Watching Mara make individual errors and then individually correct them was like watching a kind of computation the Veth had no direct equivalent for. You were wrong earlier, Xylan said to her once in the blunt, unvarnished way of a being with no social performance instincts. I know, Mara said. Does that bother you? Mara considered this. Not really, she said. I mean, I'd rather be right. But being wrong and knowing it is useful. It's being wrong and not knowing it that's a problem. Xylan reported this exchange in full to the whole. The whole sat with it for a long time. The incident happened on day 22. Zero-gravity simulation was a standard practical requirement for systems engineering students. The Institute's simulation chamber could replicate a range of gravity environments for training purposes. The session on day 22 was supposed to be a controlled low-gravity drill, a structured exercise, something the chamber systems had run hundreds of times. What it was not supposed to do was fail. The failure was later determined to have originated in a maintenance oversight, a cascade fault in the gravity plating control system that took the chamber from 0.4 G to 0 in under 3 seconds without warning, and then, more critically, locked the chamber doors as the safety system attempted to diagnose the problem. 0 G was not an emergency for any of the 4 students in the same way. Kelris experienced zero gravity as mild inconvenience. Her physical form was maintained. Electromagnetically, not gravitationally. She realigned her orientation and waited. Drogan had trained extensively in variable gravity. He caught himself on the wall bracing points with the ease of long practice, orientated within seconds, and immediately began calculating structural options. Xylan had no meaningful concept of up or down in the first place. The fragment's many-legged body anchored to the nearest surface and observed. Mara did something none of them expected. She grabbed the nearest fixed surface with both hands before she had finished processing what was happening. The motion was not elegant. It was not trained. It was fast in the way that things with no room for hesitation are fast, a pure animal old response that moved before thought did. She caught herself. She held. Then she looked around, assessed, and said, in a voice that was completely level, "Okay, Drogan, load-bearing panel is behind you, third from the left. If the door lock is magnetic, we can short it with Kelris as the source. If it's mechanical, we need to find the manual release. Xylan, can you get a data connection to the chamber's secondary system?" It was not the response of someone who was not afraid. It was the response of someone who was afraid and had made an extremely old, extremely human decision about what to do with that fact. Drogan found the panel. Kelris shorted the lock. Xylan accessed the secondary system and rerouted control. The doors opened in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. They floated out into normal gravity. Kelris reformed her full structure. Drogan rolled his neck. Xylan scuttled to the nearest horizontal surface. Mara sat down on the corridor floor, put her back against the wall and exhaled once, long and slow, with her eyes closed. Then she opened them. She looked at the 3 of them. "Everyone okay?" she said. They were. She nodded. She got up. She said she needed a glass of water and then they should probably file an incident report on the chamber malfunction. Drogan watched her walk toward the dispensary. He had been in 3 actual emergencies in his life. He had trained for emergencies for 6 years before coming to the Institute. He had watched beings twice Mara's size freeze in surprise when something went wrong. He understood, for the first time, why the Keth elders said that the most dangerous beings in any room were not the strongest ones. He went to find paper and file the report. He realized he was going to borrow Mara's pen. That night, Xylan transmitted a longer report to the whole. The whole received it and was quiet for several cycles. Then it sent back, "Observe further. We have no category for what she is." The fragment, anchored to the wall of study room 7, observed Mara sitting at the table below, filling out the incident report by hand, pausing occasionally to look at nothing for a moment, and then returning to the page. The hive mind had no word for what it was watching. It was beginning to think it needed one. 6 weeks into the semester, Station Karev 9 experienced a Class 3 structural emergency. It began, as these things often do, with a sound, not an alarm. Alarms came after. Before the alarms, there was a sound that the station made, a deep, resonant groan that traveled through the metal of the walls and the floor and the ceiling with the unhurried certainty of something that had already happened and was only now arriving at its consequences. It was 0340 station time. Most of the Institute's student population was in various stages of sleep or rest or the equivalent according to species. The cohort was not asleep. They were in the research annex on level 7, working through a late-night study session that had been Mara's suggestion and everyone's agreement, because the assignment was due in 2 days and the datasets were not cooperating. The research annex was part of the station's older wing, original construction, pre-expansion, with the particular solidity of infrastructure that had been built when they were still figuring out how to build things that lasted. The sound came. Through the floor first, Mara's head came up from her work like a needle finding magnetic north. "That's structural," she said. She said it in the same tone someone else might say it's raining. Observational, immediate, without drama. The alarms came 4 seconds later. The breach was in Research Section C, 2 corridors from the annex. A maintenance conduit, old, scheduled for replacement not yet replaced, had catastrophically failed under the stress of a thermal cycling event, splitting along a seam that had been developing microfractures for what the post-event analysis would later conclude was approximately 8 months. The failure created a breach roughly 2 meters across. The breach connected to an exterior compartment. The exterior compartment was not rated for vacuum, because it was not supposed to be a vacuum compartment. It was now. The station's automated systems responded in the correct sequence. Emergency bulkheads descended in the affected section. Atmospheric containment fields activated. Emergency routing redirected ventilation around the compromised corridor. None of this was in time to prevent 3 students from a separate cohort who had been working in Research Section C from being caught in the initial pressure event. The Institute's emergency response team was 8 minutes out, a reasonable response time for a Class 3 event on a station this size, according to every metric. 8 minutes was a specific kind of forever. Mara was already moving when the alarms were still registering with everyone else. She went for the emergency equipment locker at the end of the annex, not because she had memorized its location before an emergency, but because she had memorized its location when she arrived, the way she had memorized the food dispensary and the maintenance access points and the closest atmospheric control panel to every room she regularly occupied. She had done this without announcing it. She had done it the way people carry an umbrella, not because they know it will rain, but because they know it might. She pulled 2 emergency pressure suits from the locker. Standard Institute issue, designed for species with bilateral symmetry in the human-adjacent range. "These fit humans," she said, already pulling one on over her clothes. She looked at the others. "Kaelris, you don't need one. Drogan." She looked at him with the rapid, practical evaluation of someone solving an engineering problem in real time. "These don't fit you. Can you tolerate brief pressure variance?" "Yes," Drogan said. "Keth physiology is rated for..." "Good," she said. She was already sealed. She tossed the second suit to the empty air next to her. "Xylan, can you manage in a suit?" Xylan considered. "The fragment is adequately sealed in its own biology." "Then let's go." Drogan caught her arm. Not to stop her, to ask. "You understand that the breach corridor will have active pressure differential. Without a full rated suit, I know," she said, "the risk to a human biological system in that environment." "I know," she said again. Her voice was not sharp. It was not reckless. It carried the particular quality of someone who had already done the calculation and arrived at a conclusion and was not interested in doing it again. "There are 3 people in there. The response team is 8 minutes out. I know how to do pressure work. Let's go." She went. What followed was documented later from 6 different recording angles and became one of the more studied pieces of footage in the Institute's archive. Mara Voss moved through the compromised corridor in the near vacuum pressure zone, with 2 things: a magnetic anchor line she had pulled from the emergency locker, and a kind of focused, systematic efficiency that Kaelris would later describe, in the careful language she used when trying to translate experience across the species divide, as the most complete attention I have ever observed a biological being give to a physical problem. She reached the first student, a Keth, young, disoriented by the pressure event, and clipped the anchor line to them. She communicated via the suit's external speaker, simple instructions, slow enough to be understood through the noise, and the shock. She got the student moving, She went back for the second. The second student was Lumini, which created a specific problem, because the pressure event had disrupted the electromagnetic coherence of their physical form. They were partially dispersed. They were in distress. Mara could not physically move them in the way she had moved the first student. She did something else. She found the nearest functional atmospheric panel, blown off its housing by the initial event, half hanging from the wall, and she rerouted atmospheric flow manually through the secondary port, which required bypassing the damaged primary coupling with a technique that the panel was not designed for but that the physics did not particularly object to. She created a small pocket of partial pressure around the Lumini student. Not enough for a biological. Enough for a coherent energy form to reconsolidate. She held the bypass in place for 90 seconds with both hands while the Lumini student reformed. Drogan, watching from the edge of the pressure zone because he was too large to navigate the debris field, could see the readouts on Mara's suit. He could see what the pressure differential was doing to her biological signs. He filed it away. He returned to it later when he had more data. He never fully stopped returning to it. The third student was found by the response team, who arrived as Mara was coming back through the bulkhead with the second. The response team lead, a veteran Selvathi emergency coordinator with 20 years of crisis response, looked at Mara with an expression that crossed species readably. It was the expression of someone revising an assumption. The medical bay assessment took 3 hours. Mara had sustained what the institute physician, a gentle, Veth-adjacent being who communicated in soft translated tones, catalogued carefully. Tissue inflammation in both hands from the panel bypass. Microbarotrauma consistent with pressure exposure. Mild hypoxia effects from working in marginal atmospheric conditions for the duration of the event. The physician noted all of this and then said, with the careful phrasing of someone who understood they were navigating unfamiliar territory, "You understand that by standard biological ratings for species in your mass and composition range, the sustained pressure exposure should have produced significantly more severe systemic effects." Mara, sitting on the edge of the medical bay bed with both bandaged hands in her lap, said, "Yeah, we're weird like that." The physician looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "Humans," she said. I don't know, we're strange about this kind of thing. We break in specific ways. We're actually pretty bad at certain things, cold, certain toxins, falls, but pressure and temperature and oxygen variance, we tolerate more than makes sense for our size. We spent a few 100,000 years in genuinely terrible environments. It left some things in the biology. The physician made a note. The note was flagged. The flag was transmitted. It reached 7 different governmental and academic bodies within 48 hours and prompted a research subcommittee that would spend the next 2 years trying to understand what exactly happened at the cellular level when humans decided that a problem needed solving. Kaelris came to the medical bay that evening. She reformed her physical structure in the doorway, adjusted the light she emitted to the lower range so as not to be intrusive, and said, "May I ask you something?" "Sure," Mara said. Kaelris was quiet for a moment. The Lumini did not rush language. Language, for them, was selected the way materials were selected for construction, for precision, for load-bearing quality, for what it could hold. "In the corridor," she said, "when you were at the atmospheric panel, I could measure your biological signals. I have, as you know, a sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and biological systems produce—" She paused. "You were afraid." It was not a question. Mara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Your system was under significant duress. Your fear response was measurable and significant." "Yes." Kaelris was quiet again. Then, "And you stayed." Mara looked at her bandaged hands. She turned them over once, slowly, looking at them the way people look at familiar things that have just done something unfamiliar. "Fear's information," she said. "It's telling you something is dangerous. That's useful. You need that." She paused. "But it's not instructions." Kaelris was still for a long moment. Among the Lumini, stillness was not absence. It was the opposite. It was the state of processing so fully that no excess bandwidth remained for anything else. She was giving Mara's words the full weight of her attention. Finally, she said, "On my home system, there is no word for continuing in the direction of a known danger despite the presence of fear. We have words for calculated risk assessment. We have words for logical determination. But the thing you did, the ongoing choice moment to moment, we do not have a word for this." Mara was quiet for a moment. "We do," she said. "We actually have a lot of them." The report Xylan sent to the Hole that night was the longest it had transmitted since arriving at the Institute. It included the full documentation of the event, the corridor footage, the medical assessment, the atmospheric panel bypass, and its theoretical impossibility by most engineering standards, Kael'ras's electromagnetic readings of Mara's biological state during the event, and at the end, a single observation that the fragment offered with the careful, neutral precision of a being reporting data rather than drawing conclusions. The human was at all measurable points aware of the risk. The human was at all measurable points afraid. The human did not stop. I do not know if this is a survival advantage or something else. I suspect it may be both. The category we are missing is not one about capability. It is one about will. The Whole received this. It held it. It began slowly to build a new framework. 3 days after the incident, Mara was back in study room 7, with her hands still lightly bandaged, her paper notebook open in front of her, and a cup of something hot from the food dispensary. She was updating the map of the station she had been drawing since she arrived. It had grown considerably. A detailed hand-rendered diagram of all 9 levels with annotations in her small, precise handwriting. The medical bay had a star now. The research annex had a small flag. The emergency locker she had hit in 4 seconds because she already knew exactly where it was had a small circle around it with an arrow. Drogan sat across from her. He had been thinking for 3 days about something he wanted to say. Among the Keth, words were not used for things that action had already expressed. He had watched her go into the corridor. He had watched the footage afterward. He had read the medical assessment. He had decided that this was a thing that required words anyway. "On my homeworld," he said, "we have a concept. It translates approximately as the kind that holds the line. It is not a compliment we give to those who are strongest. It is given to those who stand in the difficult place because someone must, and who do not leave because the difficult place has become more difficult." Mara looked up from her map. Drogan held her gaze. "I am telling you because I think you should know that this is what we saw." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, that means something." She returned to her map. She added a small note near the emergency panel location, something technical, a reminder about the secondary bypass port in case she needed it again. Drogan watched her write. Xylan scuttled in through the open door, took its position on the wall, and observed. Kael'ras arrived last, reformed quietly in the far corner, and said nothing. Outside the study room's narrow viewport, the stars were where they always were, cold, permanent, indifferent to the things that moved between them. Inside, a human drew a map with a pen. The galaxy, very quietly, was learning something it had not known it needed to know. That the most remarkable thing about Mara Voss was not what she had survived. It was that she had already known she might not and had gone anyway, and that there was, on Earth, a word for this. There were, in fact, quite a few.